Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Friedemann, Assistant Director of Education at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, Board of Directors, staff, and volunteers, I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's program. The mission of Illinois Holocaust Museum is best expressed in our founding principle: remember the past, transform the future. The museum is dedicated to preserving the legacy of the Holocaust by honoring the memories of those who were lost and by teaching universal lessons that combat hatred, prejudice, and indifference. It is in that spirit that we present tonight's program, The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Before I introduce this evening's distinguished speaker, Richard Rothstein, two announcements. First, thank you to all of our community partners listed on the opening slides that you just saw for their continued support. Next, Mr. Rothstein will take questions after his formal presentation. Please ask your questions by typing them into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. He will answer as many questions as possible, but we may not get to all of them tonight. Richard Rothstein is a senior fellow at the Othering and Belonging Institute, a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, where he works on policy issues regarding education and race, and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In addition to the award-winning bestseller, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, Rothstein is the author of many articles and books on race and education, including Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. Mr. Rothstein is a highly sought-after speaker, and we are privileged and thrilled to have him with us this evening. Mr. Rothstein, take it away.
Okay. Thank you very much, Amanda. I'm privileged to be with you at this important institution this evening. I appreciate the attendance, those of you who have come to engage in this conversation with me this evening. Let me begin by reminding you, all of us, that we had a civil rights movement in this country in the 20th century. It began by challenging segregation in elementary and secondary, first in colleges and universities, and then in the Brown versus Board of Education decision in elementary and secondary schools, which banned legal segregation in schools. That Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 gave inspiration, stimulus to a civil rights movement of activists. That civil rights movement engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. Many people were injured who weren't killed. It was a terribly difficult struggle, but by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not all of it, but much of it, that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. It succeeded with its activism, as well as building on this understanding that it had spread in ending segregation and public accommodations, lunch counters, restaurants, and public transportation, buses, trains, in employment, and in 1968 succeeded in getting the passage in the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. of a Fair Housing Act that prohibited future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then the civil rights movement pretty much ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them, many metropolitan areas. I imagine some of you have lived in more than just Chicago. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. How could it be? We came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How could it be we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? It's an apartheid society we live in. We accept it. We don't feel any obligation to do anything about it. Partly it's because I think it's hard to desegregate neighborhoods once we've established them as segregated places. If we pass a law prohibiting segregation of neighborhoods, the next day you can go to any restaurant. Pass a law prohibiting segregation of restaurants. The next day you can sit in any restaurant you want. You can pass a law prohibiting segregation in buses. The next day you can ride anywhere you want on a bus in any seat. But if we pass a law prohibiting segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, Northerners, Southerners, is we've adopted a rationalization, a myth we tell ourselves to that excuses us from redressing this biggest segregation of all. And the myth goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges or schools or restaurants or public transportation, that was all done by government. It was unconstitutional. If the federal government was requiring segregation by race, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, a civil rights violation. We have an obligation as American citizens to fix that. If the state and local governments were requiring segregation by race, that was a 14th Amendment violation, also a constitutional violation, civil rights violation. And we also have an obligation as American citizens to fix it. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by law, by government, by ordinance, by public policy. That was just sort of happened by accident. It happened naturally. It happened because, private bigoted homeowners, landlords refused to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe businesses in the private economy, not government agencies, but businesses in the private sector like banks or real estate agencies or developers or insurance companies discriminated in how they carried out their jobs. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because blacks and whites like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. We would rather live with others who look just like us as we think they look just like us. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because of income differences, economic differences. African Americans, on average, not all, but on average, have lower incomes than whites, and many African Americans can't afford to move to higher opportunity, middle-class neighborhoods. All of these non-governmental, individual, bigoted, but private sector activities, people's desires to self-segregate, income differences. This is what created segregation of neighborhoods. And we tell ourselves what happened naturally, what happened by accident, can only unhappen naturally. It can only unhappen by accident. We may not like it. Many of us, I hope most of us, don't like the fact that we live in an apartheid society. But we don't assume, we don't any obligation to do anything about it. We don't feel that obligation as American citizens to fix this constitutional violation, if it is indeed a constitutional violation. Well, I spent much of my time before writing this book, writing about education policy. I wasn't much involved in housing policy until I began this particular work. In the 1990s and 2000s, I mostly was writing criticism of the dominant education theory in this country, which is the reason we have an achievement gap between Black and white children. African American children achieve on average at lower rates, at lower scores than white children. The reason we have that gap is because teachers have low expectations of Black children. They just don't try very hard. And if we could somehow force teachers to try harder, we would abolish the achievement gap. Black children's achievement would rise. I thought this was a ludicrous law. It was a policy. It was enacted into law in 2001 in the No Child Left Behind Act, which required children to be tested every year with the idea that if they were tested every year and we could hold teachers accountable for those test scores, they would be forced to have higher expectations of African-American children they taught, and the achievement gap would disappear. So I say, I thought this was a ludicrous law, a ludicrous policy, because although they're certainly true, some teachers have low expectations. That's not the primary reason for an achievement gap between Black and white children. The primary reason is that so many Black children from economically disadvantaged families and backgrounds come to school with challenges that interfere with their ability to learn, and that can't be addressed simply by higher teacher expectations. So I remember writing one column about 20 years ago now about asthma. African-American children in low-income neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous gap in asthma symptoms. The reason that African-American children have asthma at such a higher rate is because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through the neighborhoods, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely, not necessarily, but more likely than a child without asthma, to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement simply because sleepier children don't achieve as well as children who are well rested and wide awake. And it doesn't make a big difference. Asthma has a small impact on the achievement gap, but then you can begin to think about all these other conditions. Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ. Homelessness, economic insecurity, many other similar challenges. You add them all up, you pretty much explained the achievement gap. There's a little bit left to explain with low teacher expectations, but it's not a significant factor. I began to think about this probably about 15, 20 years ago, and soon realized that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. It's another thing if you have a school where every child has either asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. How can you ever expect the school with those kinds of concentrated challenges to achieve at the same level as a school that has children who come healthy and well-rested and well-nourished and in economically secure homes? Of course, you can't expect that. And as it turned out, the No Child Left Behind law that did expect that was an utter failure. It did not close the achievement gap. All it mainly did was give an incentive to schools teaching low-income, disadvantaged African-American children to abandon a well-rounded curriculum so that they could drill children in math and reading to try to boost their test scores. This is what I was thinking about. In those days, we call schools where we concentrate children with these kinds of social and economic disadvantages. We call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that neighborhood segregation might be an educational problem. I still wasn't focused on housing until I read a decision of the Supreme Court in 2007 that evaluated 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of these districts had a desegregation plan that was very token trivial. It gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate segregation, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of a child who would not do so. So if you had an all-white, a mostly white school, and a Black and a white child applied for the last remaining place, Black child would be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program. How often do you have a school with one place left and both a Black and a white child apply for that last remaining place? This was not a very powerful program, but nonetheless, The Supreme Court denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Chief Justice explained, it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he said, the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That is, in fact, why the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. And then he went on to explain that those neighborhoods are segregated de facto, just in fact, not in law, because of the reasons I described before, private bigotry, businesses in the private sector, self-choice, income differences. And he said, if you have de facto segregation where government wasn't involved, government is prohibited from doing anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered at the time reading about something that happened some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two school districts involved in this decision. In Louisville, there was a suburb outside Louisville called Shively. It was an all-white suburb of single-family homes. One of the white homeowners in that suburb of all-white families had an African-American friend who was living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to buy a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this single-family suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, an angry mob of neighbors, white neighbors, surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop that. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family that provoked a riot. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the courts, the prosecutors are engaged in mobilizing to enforce racial boundaries in Louisville, Kentucky. I began to look into it further, and I'm not exaggerating here. There were hundreds and hundreds of cases nationwide, not just in border states like Louisville, but in Chicago, in Detroit, in New York, in Baltimore, in Washington, in Kansas City, in Denver, in Los Angeles, and San Francisco, all across the country. Cases of police-protected mob violence, sometimes police-led and organized mob violence, designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these cases where the police was involved in protecting or leading or organizing violence to enforce racial boundaries was a 14th Amendment violation, one that every one of us has an obligation to remedy, but we've never done so. I began to look into it further, and I learned, and this is what resulted in the book, The Color of Law, that it wasn't just police state-sponsored violence that enforced racial boundaries, created racial boundaries in this country, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit federal policies and state and local policies that ensured that we would live in a segregated society, that African Americans and whites could not live near one another. Let me describe some of the more powerful federal policies that were enacted and employed in the 20th century to create the segregation that lives with us today. They were so powerful that they still determine today's racial landscape. Perhaps the most powerful one is a policy of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white working class and middle class populations that was presently living in urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs, like that one in Shively that I described a few minutes ago. This was a racially explicit federal policy. We were not a suburban country at that time. The only people living in suburbs were affluent families, working and middle-class families, excuse me, were living in urban areas because we were a manufacturing economy. And workers had to live near the factories where they worked. They had to walk or take short streetcar rides to get to them. And the factories had to be located in a central area near either a deep water port or a railroad terminal to get their parts and ship their final products. So we had many African American and white workers living in sometimes broadly integrated neighborhoods in downtown areas near the factories where they worked. The federal government wanted to move the white families out of those areas into single family homes in the suburbs. You're familiar with all these suburbs. They exist in every metropolitan area of this country. They create a white noose around Chicago and every other city in this country. The biggest one of these projects, you may have heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes east of New York. The developer, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to undertake a project of that size on his own. No bank would lend him the money. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money. 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. How is he going to get a loan to buy the land and build those houses? The only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration immediately after World War II, proposing his plans for the development, the architectural design of the houses, the materials he was going to use in construction, the layout of the streets, every detail, and a federally required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required him to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. Those deeds still are in existence in not only Levittown, but in communities all over this country. If any of you live in a house that was built in the mid-20th century, look at your deed. You'll find that you're probably living in a home that's forbidden to anybody but Caucasians. It's not enforceable anymore, but the language is in the deed. You can't remove it any more than you can change any other part of the deed. You can't wake up in the middle of the night and decide you want a different property line, change your deed. The deed is the deed. So this was a federal requirement. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. The Federal Housing Administration issued a manual distributed to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to recommend or not recommend applications of developers for federally guaranteed loans to build these subdivisions. The manual said explicitly that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who would sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer of an all-white project if the project was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. It has no basis in fact whatsoever. It's a myth we tell ourselves that we have de facto segregation. Well, the suburbs were created on this basis, a racially exclusive basis by the federal government in violation of the Fifth Amendment. They were inexpensive homes. They sold at the time in the mid-20th century. These homes all across the country sold at the time for about $8,000, $9,000. In today's money, inflation adjusted, that's about $100,000. White families bought those homes. African Americans were prohibited from buying them, even though they had jobs in the post-war economy too, and any white or black working class family could afford to buy a home for $100,000 if they were a returning war veteran from World War II. No down payment was required. The homes that they bought for $100,000 that the white families bought that the African Americans were prohibited from buying then began to gain in value over the next couple of generations. They now no longer sell for $100,000. You can't buy a home for $100,000 in any of these federally created suburbs around the major cities. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the equity that they gained in the appreciation of their homes. Most American families who have any wealth get it from the equity they have in their homes. White families gained that wealth from their equity and the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used it to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps finance temporary emergencies, medical or unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal racial policy from participating in this wealth-generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. You'd think that if the average family income of an African American was 60% of the average family income of a white American, that wealth would also have a 60% ratio. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, while African American family incomes are about 60% of white family incomes, African American wealth is only about 5% of white wealth on average. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that we have never remedied. It has created much of the racial inequality that we still have in this country today, and the biggest social problems that we have in this country today. The wealth gap that prevents African Americans from moving to higher opportunity communities, from having the down payments for homes, is responsible in large part for that achievement gap that I talked about earlier, that concentrates the most disadvantaged young African American children in single neighborhoods with all sorts of social and economic challenges that they confront. The wealth gap that we created predicts health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you probably know, have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods. It predicts mass incarceration and police abuse of young African American men, because when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs or transportation to get to those jobs, or access to schools with high achievement, or any of the other amenities of a higher income neighborhood, when you concentrate those men in single neighborhoods, the police inevitably engage in confrontations with them. They behave like an occupying force. And the stances of police in occupying low-income neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods in this country, is quite similar to the stances of occupying forces in colonial countries in the 20th century, whether in India or the Congo or any of the other countries in the third world where occupying forces kept the population under control. I'm not suggesting that there would not be any police abuse of African Americans if we didn't have segregation, but it would be much, much, much less, much more minimized. Segregation intensifies it. And the segregation that we created with this wealth gap and with many other federal policies, state and local policies, also predicts something else, which I think is very dangerous and frightening. And that's the very, very great political polarization that we have in this country today. That largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to preserve or create even the common national identity that we need to sustain this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other? We have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences, no ability to create the conditions where we consider ourselves common Americans with common interests and common ambitions and common desires. That's a consequence of the racial segregation that we, our government on our behalf, created. Well, let me describe one other federal policy in the time I have left. There are many, many others in state and local policies as well. But another policy I'll describe is public housing, something we all misunderstand. I know that the Illinois Public Housing Museum is one of the sponsors of this event. It's a place that I admire greatly. Public housing did not begin as a place for poor people. Public housing in this country began in the New Deal, in the Depression, during the Roosevelt administration. Poor people weren't allowed in public housing. It was for working class families, middle class families who could afford the full cost of the housing and their rent. It was not subsidized. People were paying the full cost in their rent. The reason that the New Deal was creating public housing was because there was a housing shortage, because so little construction activity was going on, and people who could afford to rent housing, people with jobs in the industrial economy, couldn't find housing. Everywhere the federal government built housing for middle-class, working-class families in the 1930s and even into the 1940s, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently segregating neighborhoods where segregation hadn't previously existed. As I mentioned earlier, we had many integrated downtown neighborhoods in the 20th century. We'd be stunned if we were somehow transported back to that period of American history to see the extent of integration that could exist in many places. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes wrote in his autobiography, The Big C, that he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood called the Central Neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl in high school. It's what you would not be surprised to see in an integrated high school and an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Cleveland, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for African Americans, one for whites. And with those and other segregated projects elsewhere in the Cleveland area, created a pattern of segregation that still exists to this day. In the book, The Color of Law, I try where I can to focus on self-satisfied, smug places. They may think they're better than you are. Chicago, better than you are in Chicago. Cambridge, Massachusetts is one of them. Maybe you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white and half black. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that neighborhood and built two separate projects. The federal government built separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation there, and then with other similar segregated projects elsewhere in the Boston metropolitan area, created segregation in that community. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries that hadn't existed before. Whites and blacks, migrants, came to the locations of war plants. If the federal government wanted the planes and the tanks and the jeeps and the aircraft carriers to be produced, it had to create housing for these workers, and it did. Everywhere it created housing for war workers. It created on a segregated basis, separate housing for whites, separate housing for African Americans. These were frequently workers working in the same war plants, but having to live separately. This is how the West Coast came to be segregated. There were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. But the federal government created segregation with separate war plans. In San Francisco, the government built 5 housing projects for war workers. Separate housing projects. 5 projects for war workers. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans, creating the African neighborhood of San Francisco that hadn't previously existed. And the same policy was followed in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast. It was segregated by the federal government, initially for war workers during World War II. Well, The policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. Policy experts, housing experts, think tanks, journalists like me spin out ideas all the time about how to redress segregation. What's missing is not policy ideas to redress segregation. What's missing is a new civil rights movement, like the one we had in the 1960s. Tactics may be different, but a new civil rights movement that's going to be as aggressive in challenging the segregation of neighborhoods as the civil rights movement in the 1960s was in challenging the segregation of buses and lunch counters and water fountains and so on. I can describe a few of the policies that are so easy to imagine, but are so completely politically unrealistic at this point without a civil rights movement, just to give you an idea of what challenges lie ahead of us. I mentioned the suburbanization on an all-white basis that the federal government created in the mid-20th century. Those homes, as I said, sold for $100,000 at the time and now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The federal government should have an affirmative action program to undo the damage it created with the creation of those suburbs on an all-white basis when African Americans could have afforded to purchase homes there. The federal government should be buying up homes at market rates as they come up for sale in places like Levittown or other suburbs throughout the country, and reselling those homes to qualified working middle-class African Americans at deeply discounted rates, something closer to the $100,000 that their families would have paid for them had they been permitted to purchase them when whites were permitted to purchase them. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very explicit, clear federal constitutional violation. In light of the history I've described, it would be impregnable, but we're nowhere near ready to implement such a policy. We have programs at the low end of the income scale, not for middle and low and working class African Americans, but for lower income families, disproportionately African American and Hispanic. The biggest one is the low income housing tax credit, which is a subsidy to builders. The Treasury Department, the US Treasury Department issues tax credits, distributes them to states, and states in turn distribute them to developers, to builders, to create low income units of housing. The Treasury Department regulations place a priority on creating low income housing tax credit units in already low income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. It's crazy. We should be doing the opposite. It's not that we shouldn't be building any low income housing tax credit units in existing low income neighborhoods. Every neighborhood should have better housing. But we shouldn't be placing a priority on reinforcing segregation. Instead, we should be finding ways to place more of those low income housing tax credit units in high opportunity neighborhoods where low income families who had access to good jobs, better jobs, and transportation and healthy air, fresh food, and all of the amenities of higher income, higher opportunity neighborhoods. Same thing is true of the Section 8 voucher program. That reinforces segregation today. It's a subsidy to families to rent apartments that they otherwise would not be able to afford at the average rents of a metropolitan area. It doesn't take a genius to realize that if you're going to set the subsidy for the average rent in the metropolitan area, that will be too low to permit rental in a high opportunity community and too high for a low-income segregated neighborhood. So landlords in those neighborhoods can exploit the program by charging more than the market requires. We should change that program so that higher vouchers are issued to families who seek homes, seek to rent apartments in higher opportunity places, and lower amount vouchers to families who choose to seek homes in already segregated neighborhoods. There are some communities, a very few communities, that are making those kinds of adjustments in their Section 8 housing program, but not very many. So as I say, this is just one of many, many examples of policies we could implement to redress segregation. Another big one, I'll mention one more, and that is the zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction in many high-income communities, mostly white, prohibit the construction of anything but single-family homes on large lot sizes, making it impossible to construct townhouses or garden apartments or low-level apartment buildings that working families who are not white would be able to afford and have access to the amenities of a higher opportunity community. Those zoning ordinances, I think, are unconstitutional because they perpetuate an unconstitutionally created segregation. But again, without a civil rights movement, we're not about to see those zoning ordinances change. I'm involved at present with a group of national civil rights leaders who are creating something that they call the National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation. It's about to launch. If any of you want to be on the mailing list to receive information about that launch, perhaps I can figure out a way of getting information to you about how you can sign up to be on that mailing list. There are many things that all of you can do in your local communities to start, or when you create a local civil rights group to proceed with this kind of activity. Perhaps the most obvious one is challenging the way schools teach this myth of de facto segregation. In the book, The Color of Law, I review all the textbooks that are commonly used in American history classes across this country. Every one of them lies about this history. They propagate the notion of de facto segregation that's utterly mythical. They praise the federal government's work in creating suburbs without ever mentioning it was for whites only. They boast of how important the New Deal was in creating housing for workers who couldn't find housing, never mentioning that it was always segregated. This national committee that I've talked about, the National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation, has sponsored the creation of an accurate curriculum unit to teach this history. We've also sponsored a 17-minute animated video for high school students that summarizes this history. Again, I can make the links to both of these. They're free to those of you who are interested in this. About 2 months ago, I'll conclude with this. About 2 months ago, I wrote a column and an article actually in the New York Times, which I picked one community, but there are many in the Chicago area that are just like it. All white, created as a segregated community in the 1940s, and it remains all white and unaffordable today to African Americans or even to white working class families as well. In this article, I described how you can research and identify the builder, the bank, the real estate agent that cooperated with the federal government in creating this all-white community. Each of those private institutions, the bank, the real estate agency, the developer, still exists today, to this day, in that community. A civil rights group in that community should be making it uncomfortable for those institutions not to contribute to the redress of segregation, perhaps by setting up a private reparations fund that would subsidize the movement of families who are historically unconstitutionally excluded from that community to have access to it. So the policies to redress segregation are well known. What's missing is a new civil rights movement. I'm hopeful that when it begins to emerge, that those of you who are participating in this webinar this evening will consider whether to become part of it. With that, I want to stop and use our remaining time for questions and discussion. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you for this meaty presentation. You've given us quite a bit to think about, and we have a number of questions. We will get through as many of them as we can. To start us off, what kind of case, if any, do you think could come before the courts now to reverse the Roberts position of de facto segregation?
Well, could come before the court? Unlikely, because it won't make its way up through the lower courts, because the courts are not cognizant or willing to take cognizance of this history. If it did, if the courts acknowledged the unconstitutional way in which segregation was created, they would have to entertain policies to redress it. But until there's a much broader understanding of it, until there's a popular movement, I don't expect that litigation will be the way to solve this. I'm not suggesting that civil rights lawyers will be put out of business. They'll have lots of work to do defending policies that an aggressive civil rights movement succeeds in getting implemented. But I don't think that litigation is the first step in changing the makeup of our segregated landscape.
Thank you. Speaking of that civil rights movement that you've mentioned, we've gotten a number of questions asking if you feel that the protests that we saw around the country this summer in particular could be that civil rights movement that could affect change in this area.
Well, they certainly create the conditions in which, from which a civil rights movement can emerge. I think it's very encouraging. 25 million Americans participated in those Black Lives Matter demonstrations. A majority of those participants were white. That was unheard of. That's unheard of in American history, to have this kind of biracial participation in civil rights activity. So I think I'm very encouraged. You know, we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race in this country now, about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow than we ever have had before in American history. I think out of that discussion, a new civil rights movement can emerge, but the discussion itself is not a civil rights movement, nor is the Black Lives Matter movement that demonstrations that appropriately were focused on police reform, on community policing, on the demilitarization of police. It wasn't focused on the underlying condition of segregation that creates police abuse. And but it's created the conditions under which a civil rights movement can emerge. So I'm very hopeful, not confident, but I'm hopeful.
Thank you. We have another question about if you believe there's a possible relationship between the Interstate Highway Act, the segregation of urban communities. If you could comment on that. Oh,
sure. I wrote about this in the book. The best example I know of is in Chicago. The Dan Ryan Expressway was routed to create a barrier between white and black neighborhoods. The interstate highway system, as it was designed, as the spurs were designed, or even that went into center cities, or even when, as with the Dan Ryan, it was the main highway went through the city. Local authorities were given the authority, local politicians were given the authority to route those spurs or that route of the main highway, and they frequently did it on a racial basis. It's not only the Dan Ryan Expressway created that kind of barrier. There were other highways that were used for the purpose of demolishing black communities that city planners wanted to move away from downtown areas into distant places which were even less, had even less opportunity for jobs and healthy living amenities. In my book, The Color of Law, I describe how the I-95 interstate highway was routed through a black neighborhood of Miami for the explicit purpose of destroying that neighborhood and forcing the African Americans to move away. And this was duplicated in many, many communities in this country. So the short answer to your question is yes.
Thank you. We have a question from a teacher actually at a prep school in Indiana who teaches your book, The Color of Law, with her students in a domestic policy class. She noted that the final chapter suggests a rather reasonable pessimism about the possibility of significant progress given political obstacles, as much as, quote, personal or psychological ones. Given the political landscape of the moment and the events of this year, protests, et cetera, as you just described, has your level of pessimism or optimism changed?
Well, I have a very short memory at my old age. I don't remember being pessimistic, but I'm certainly not pessimistic now. It's not just the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. My book has had a stunning reception. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that some teachers would be teaching it in schools. But it's not just my book. It's uh, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. It's Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. It's the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates. If you look at the bestseller lists of books in this country, you find that many, if not most, books on the nonfiction list from one week to another are about race. We have white elected Southern politicians running around the South removing statues that commemorate slavery. We have a bipartisan movement in Congress today to rename military bases that are named after Confederate generals. The only opponent of that renaming is the President of the United States. And so I'm very, very hopeful that out of this new awareness of the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow, that a new civil rights movement can emerge. I'm not confident, but I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Do federal opportunity zones further exacerbate residential segregation? And is this an example of the de facto situation that you've been discussing?
Well, I don't think I've been discussing a de facto segregation. I've been saying that de facto segregation doesn't exist. It's all unconstitutional. The legal term is de jure segregation. Well, opportunity zones are just the newest version of an old idea that's never worked. We used to call them enterprise zones. The idea is you give tax credits to businesses that invest in disadvantaged neighborhoods, with the idea that that's going to revitalize those neighborhoods and bring new resources and opportunities to those neighborhoods. Opportunity zones are even less likely to do that than the old enterprise zones, which failed in doing it, because opportunity zones are defined in such broad geographical terms that they include, there are very few opportunity zones that include only low-income neighborhoods. The opportunity zones are so big that they include both low income and high income and commercial and downtown neighborhoods, so all in one opportunity zone. So an investor can invest money in an affluent community that's part of an opportunity zone and get the tax credits for that development. Perhaps the most well-publicized example was a sports stadium that was built with tax credits from an opportunity zone, because the opportunity zone was defined so broadly that it included the area of the sports stadium as well as the area where African-American low-income families were living. So no, I don't expect the opportunity zones to be successful in this regard.
The most frequent question that we have received this evening is a request for your website, the different links that you've mentioned. Is there some place that we can point people to get more information?
Well, do you have the email addresses of people who've registered for this session? Well, I'll send you tomorrow morning, probably not tonight, but tomorrow morning I'll send you all the information about the websites, about the National Committee to Redress Racial Segregation. I'll send you these curriculum units that we've created, the 17-minute video, and you can then distribute it to the attendees at this webinar.
Perfect.
How's that?
Perfect. Thank you. You have just made quite a few attendees extremely happy. We need to wrap up, but we have time for, I think, one more question. So I'm going to pick a good one for us to close on. I think another question that has come up frequently from our viewers tonight is, and you've kind of indirectly addressed this in a few different ways, but specifically the linking of property taxes and school funding, and the ways that that perpetuates the systems that we have been talking about this evening. Could you talk a little bit about that issue and possible ways to address that?
Well, sure. But it's a very complicated issue. There are some communities, some areas, some cities with low-income populations which have very high property tax revenues from the commercial property in those cities. So it's not that every place that has low-income children has low property tax revenues. New York City, for example, and Chicago is similar as well, New York City spends, I think, $18,000 per pupil, far more than most middle-class districts anywhere in the country. So certainly schools need more money, and especially schools serving disadvantaged children. Even the enormous amount of money that New York or New Jersey or Chicago spends is not enough to deal with the kinds of problems I was talking about earlier. Children who come to school with social and economic disadvantages that schools cannot possibly overcome on their own. So we have a crazy property tax system. We certainly shouldn't be financing schools based on the property taxes of their local communities. But fundamentally, that's not the cause of the achievement gap in schools. The achievement gap in schools like New York City is as great as it is in schools around the country, which spend 1/3 that amount. So it's the biggest cause of the achievement gap in schools is the concentration, the segregation of children in schools where their disadvantages are compounded. And money is not going to solve that problem. The only thing that's going to solve that problem is desegregating neighborhoods. And if we have desegregated neighborhoods, we'll have desegregated neighborhood schools. And that will ultimately be the solution. I'm certainly not opposed to school finance reform. It's a very important thing to do. Schools need more money, especially schools serving disadvantaged children. But that's not the panacea to solving these problems.
Thank you, Richard Rothstein, for such a thought-provoking evening and for sharing your time and insights with us. And thank you to everyone attending this program. Just a few quick announcements before we wrap up. Please take a moment to fill out the survey for tonight's program. The link is in the chat box. The survey helps us to know how we're doing and gives us important information to share with our funders. Also, as of this evening, the museum is temporarily closed to the public. We hope that you'll continue to take advantage of our many virtual offerings, including virtual tours of Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and our fabulous upcoming public programs. We hope in particular you'll join us this Sunday, November 22nd at 3 p.m. for our Remembering the Holodomor Commemorating the Famine Genocide in Ukraine program, which will be happening virtually. For more information and to register for upcoming virtual tours and programming, click on the link to the museum events page, which is also in the chat box. Once again, thank you to everyone who attended this evening, and Richard Rothstein, thank you as well.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks to all of you for engaging with me this evening.
Good night, everyone. We'll see you again virtually very soon, and hopefully at the museum in person soon as well.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.